Hello there, Cars and Crafters. Welcome to another episode of Cars and Crafts. Today we'll be going over installation of the rear main seal conversion kit on the TD and TF. So to get started, I wanted to let you guys know that this is not a simple 1 through 10, follow the steps exactly, and it'll work every time. There's a lot of going back and forth. You have to put things on, take them off, get them fitted correctly, make sure everything's fitting properly before you install the next step, before you go on to the next step. So I urge you to watch the whole video. I also urge you to follow your instructions in this manual here. There's going to be a lot of things that you're not going to be ready for, so read the whole thing, watch the whole video, make sure you have everything that you need, including tools and everything that came with the kit. Make sure you have everything there, and then you can start making these steps towards installing this modern type rear main seal. There's a lot to go over, so let's get started. Hey there, Cars and Crafters. So I've realized as I'm starting to put this engine back together that it's a little more complicated than tearing it apart. But no fear, we'll be able to figure this out. So the first thing I noticed is that they want you to make sure the flange on the back of the crank is nice and smooth, and they recommend you get a speedy sleeve, which is like $73 plus shipping from Moss. They said you can do it without it. My flange looks pretty smooth. Just going to smooth it out with some sandpaper and go finer and finer as I go. I'm at 320 right now. I'm probably going to go down to 800 or so. Probably won't need to be that smooth, but I'm here, I'm going to do it anyways, so let's do it. So I've wrapped the sandpaper, it's sticky back sandpaper, and put some tape along the seam here, and I'm just going to go around and around until it's nice and smooth. So that was 600 grit. It's not perfect, but it's good enough to make a good seal all the way around. The seal will end up probably 3/4 towards the inside, and then make the seal all the way to about halfway. So from here to here, and there's a smooth enough surface all the way around where it will seal just perfectly fine. So next step. Next they tell you to remove the slinger, and there's 2 pins here and 3 bolts. Remove the 3 bolts, and then you have to pry it away from the pins here. Remove that and tap out these 3 bolt holes with a 6mm by 1 tap. Next they ask you to bolt this top plate on, 1 bolt at a time, to see if these bolts are too long or not. And if they are too long, you're supposed to trim them. So it appears these two need to be trimmed. Wouldn't hurt to trim all three, but yeah, maybe we'll do all three just in case. It seemed to be bottoming out right as it was tightening on. I'm going to run a 6x1 die on each of these screws so that I know they're going to thread in nicely. Next, they want you to tighten it back on and see if this plate is touching any of these webs in the casting. So they all seem to be free. I've got a little feeler gauge here. All of them are free except for this one here. It stops right there. I took off the bracket here and I noticed there's a big difference between this face here and this webbing. So there's no way this could be touching. In fact, same with all of these here, so time to put it back on. After this we can grease up the bearings and put the crank back in. Now they want you to lube the bearings and install the crank. So the next thing they ask you to do is to measure between the flange and the bracket here, and if it's bigger than 0.025, then you need to put a gasket behind it to bring it closer to the flange so that the seal will seat where it needs to go on the flange. So as you can see, I got a huge gap here. That's 0.026. Which is more than 0.025, and it's wobbling around like crazy. So I went to my local auto parts store and got the thickest gasket I could find. They had all different sizes. They had cork, they had paper, thinner paper. Look in the performance section if they don't have normal stuff. The performance section usually has different types. So anyways, I think this will work. I'm able to shove the paper down inside there in between the two, and I'm able to shove 0.020, which is the minimum, and they both fit. So if I squish the paper down, that'll give me somewhere between 0.020 and 0.026. So this is perfect. Yeah, so find something that works for you. So when I took off this slinger, it actually had a gasket underneath it. So I'm just going to copy this gasket. And cut it out. Alright, we can now put the gasket on, and we can put this top bracket back on. Now we can put the crank back in and measure one more time. .020 fits on both sides. And it's nice and smooth too, it doesn't stick in there. So, little bit too big, let's try that. And doesn't go in at all, good. Perfect. Awesome. That is the perfect size gasket for that. Next, the instructions say to try to install the bottom part of the seal retainer. And they say it's probably going to be a tight fit because this bearing cap is going to be too fat. So you're going to have to grind the face of the bearing cap so that this will fit. And you can see it's not a machined finish. So we got to make that nice and flat. From the color of those sparks, can you tell whether it was cast iron or cast steel? Comment down below. Alright, so they say to bolt this one on first and then install the bearing cap. Now there's supposed to be a very small gap. It says 0.01 to 0.015. Doesn't fit all the way around. It looks like I'm gonna have to take this off again and give it another go. Alright, I think I got it this time. That slid on much easier. And voila. Remove your top plate one last time. Remove your gasket. We're going to use Permatex sealant on there. I want to seal it up real good. Also, I'm going to seal that side as well. So leave these loose. Get them on most of the way so they're starting to touch, but don't tighten them down yet. There's an adjustment that needs to be done with the second half after the crank is back in. Now reinstall your crank, bolt down all the bearing caps, and once you've done that, you can install this alignment tool, and that will get this bottom piece ready for you to bolt down. Got 3 holes that match up with those bolts on the bottom half there, or the top half in this case. And then you insert these old bolts from the slinger so that you can move this around and line up those holes. Now once you've got these all tightened down and then all those tightened down, it is in a correct position for this to make a good seal. Now because I wasn't done assembling the engine yet, I went ahead and bolted the top half of the seal holder on with the sealer, and it's in the correct position because of the alignment tool. I didn't want to glue this up yet because I wasn't ready to install the crank. So what they ask you to do in the directions is to go ahead and put a bead on each of these grooves, and then this is already installed. You slide this in, squish it together, bolt everything down, let it dry for 6 hours, and then take this off as one piece, and then you drill a hole where that hole already is. You drill a hole through there. I already made an outline so I know where it's supposed to go, and then I made a little dot there where the drill hole needs to go. This hole is going to be here, so any oil that collects in this area right here will be able to come out through this hole, and back into the sump. So we're ready to test the bolts. The bolts are apparently going to be a little too long, so they'll need to be adjusted as well. So we will install this on the crank while it's in the block and put the bolts in, tighten them down evenly, and we'll see how far they stick out. Don't forget to take your dowel pins out. All you have to do is take a brass hammer and pound them out from the engine side. I've already done this, so it'll come out easy. This flywheel will literally only go on one way. As you can see, this is not a perfect X. These top three don't look half bad, but this one looks like it's been pushed that way a bit. So I think this is going to be on the top. That's going to be on my right, left, and down. We'll give it a shot. So I tightened them all down in a crisscross pattern, as tight as I could go with my decent sized wrench. I imagine my torque wrench, getting the correct torque on there, isn't going to be much more than that. So all the bolts fit just fine and do not interfere with the new seal housing. So I have no need to adjust the bolts at all. I don't have to grind them or anything. So one less step for me. The fear is some bolts have been stretched, they've been over tightened or just normal tightened, and the bolts stretch when that happens. Sometimes mine either stretched not too far or didn't stretch at all, so I'm good to go. Next, the directions tell you to install the seal. So if you have the speedy sleeve that goes around the flange, they tell you to mask the front edge because it could be sharp and you don't want to damage the seal as it goes on. They say you can also put some oil around it to help lube that up so it slips on easier. From what I've heard from experienced mechanics about Teflon seals like this one, is that they go on dry. I'm not sure if that's the case with this seal or not. I'm gonna put it on dry. You can put it on wet with oil if you want. I'm gonna let you know how it goes with me, and you can let me know how it goes with you. Another thing is, don't do what I did. I bent my seal. You can see a crease here and here. And I did that because this part was on the bottom and I couldn't see what I was doing. And I slipped it on, and that bottom lip was not lining up correctly, and it all got all bent up inside there. So I went ahead and ordered a new one. 113 bucks later, and I guess I'll save that other one in case of an emergency. It didn't look completely torn up, but it looked bent enough that I didn't want to risk it. Okay, so before I put my seal on, I'm going to put some degreaser on a rag. This is wax and grease remover I use in painting. You can use brake clean, carburetor cleaner, anything like that. Get the grease off. Take your seal. This is what I learned from last time. Put the bottom portion in first and pull up on it and stretch it. So bottom in first. So the bottom's slipping on, slipping on. It's actually the top of the engine, but since this is upside down, I'm calling it the bottom. So the seal at the top of the engine is on first, and then work your way around. You can even twist it a little bit and make sure it all goes on. Don't bend that seal as it goes on the flange. Pull up, slide over. And it's got to go all the way into the retainer housing. So keep being gentle, pushing it in, lifting up so that it wants to go in the retainer housing. Next, you want to remove the center and front bearing caps and remove the crank with the seal still attached. Now lift off the crank and set it aside. Make sure not to disturb the seal. Next, apply a thin bead of sealant in this groove. Next, you reinstall the crank, making sure the seal stays at 90 degrees. As you place it in. Install the front and center bearing caps. Next, you apply sealant to the inside of the bottom retainer. And this just needs to be a slight smear, so you can wipe it off so that it's a very thin layer. Install the rear bearing cap, making sure the seal still lines up. Install the two nuts on the rear main bearing cap and tighten them down. Install the retainer bolts. Don't tighten them down just yet. You can screw them in, but don't tighten them down just yet. Now you take the alignment tool, you line it up here. If you can reach your hammer in there, you give it a few light taps. I'm pretty confident that's where the seal needs to be. I'm putting pressure on it and it's not moving at all. And it didn't move during any of this process. Just make sure it's sticking out evenly all the way around. Sealant is leaking out a little bit around the edges. You can clean that up with a paper towel. Now you're ready to tighten this down. Just do it evenly on both sides. Don't over tighten on one side and then move to the other. It's already pretty much there. Now you're ready to torque down the bearing cap nuts and then wire them in place or use a cotter pin. Now tighten down the bearing caps to 62.5 foot-pounds and then to the next hole. I got all those wired up with cotter pins. Now it's time to get the flywheel on. In the instructions they tell you to machine the back of the flywheel down to 0.08. I had to get it machined down further to 0.04 more or less. Before you do any machining on the back of the flywheel, take a measurement between where the face of the flange is and the face of the seal. And that's your minimum distance of the back of the flywheel. And there you have it. It's about 0.044. So you've got to machine that down to less than that. And then check all the way around. You're going to want to get it to the smallest of the minimums. If you're too thick on the back of that plate, it's going to rub up against this seal and potentially burn through it. Or your flywheel might even not let the engine turn because it's pressed up against it so hard. It says to install the flywheel next and hand tighten the bolts. So go ahead and tighten down the flywheel and double check for clearance issues on the back. Okay, I don't hear anything coming from back here. I double checked earlier. With the gap tool, and there seems to be plenty of gap back there. Wonderful. So now you can Loosen these one at a time. Add some silicone RTV sealant. Run it back in, and then torque each one of them down. And then once those are all sealed and torqued, you can run the dowel pins in with some sealant as well. There you have it. That shouldn't leak at all. So I'm just putting a pry bar under the crank there, and it's keeping it from turning while I torque these bolts down. Just wanted to show you guys. I got this from my daughter today for Father's Day. She drew it. So hopefully this helped you guys out. If you're anything like me, you hate to get a really long project like this done and have a leak or some other small problem that bugs the crap out of you. So this is just one of those things that you want to get right the first time. If you guys like this video, please give a thumbs up. Please subscribe. These videos are a lot of fun for me to do, and I enjoy helping you guys out. The more subscribers we can get, the more support that shows me that you guys appreciate these videos, and then I can keep doing them. So thanks guys. Always remember to stay crafty. Bye. I've always been able to make it home, and so it feels pressure and stops. Fuel and it can't start. So the gas and fuel lines there. Quit licking me. Oops. Miles, that's not nice. Look at my face.
How do you feel after that?
Bryson's gonna flip on the ignition for me, and we're gonna see how pretty it looks now. And it looks brand spanking new. Got the new axles in. Check the video out that I made of that. Got a few new panels on. This front panel was missing, so that's new.